4 степени Владимир Познер. Представлен к боевым наградам, включая пурпурное сердце и бронзовую звезду. Обладатель 3 премий «Оскар», автор сценария и режиссер громких кинокартин «Взвод», «Лицо со шрамом», «Уолл-стрит», «Сноуден», «Интервью с Путиным» и более 20 других фильмов. Культовый режиссер-документалист, предлагающий новый взгляд на важнейшие события современной истории. Оливер Стоун.
Good morning.
Good morning. Intimate breakfast. Thank you.
Have you ever been driven out on a stage in a car?
I've never had so many thousands of people listening in.
Neither have I.
Makes me a little cautious, but I hope to enjoy our conversation. But let's talk freely. We're a little bit far apart, but I guess that's the way.
Actually, you know, we could get closer together.
Are we allowed to?
I think so. Why don't I try to do this? Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I have some water, too?
Could Mr. Stone have some water, please? They'll bring it, I think. You're best known in this country.
Oh, thank you. Well, we've readjusted this.
Спасибо.
Yes.
You're best known in this country for your movies and for the series that you did with President Putin, the 4 interviews. They were on Channel 1, which has the largest footprint in Russia, so it was seen by a huge number of people. And I've often been asked by people that I meet here about those interviews. And the first question, and I said that if I ever interviewed you again, I would ask those questions that they asked me. And the first question is, why did you do it? What was your purpose? What did you hope to achieve?
Well, the why, first of all, I have to say we were able to do it because Mr. Putin was very generous and he opened himself up to this possibility. When I interviewed him, when I met him socially for the first time, it was about Snowden. I was shooting the end of Snowden here in Moscow, and I asked him a few questions about his view of the case. What he said to me was quite open and very different from what the Americans had said he said. He was specific, and I thought it was fascinating that he was open and articulate and interested. And we asked him, Fernando Sulichin, who's here today, my producer, asked him if he would allow us to come back, which he did. We came back on an ad hoc basis as we went. One time, 3 days. He was very busy, 2 hours here, 3 hours there. It was always catch as you catch can. Catch as catch can. And then we went back after June of 2014, and 6 months later we asked if we could come back, and they said yes. Again, same type of deal. 6 months later we came back again. We thought after 3 interviews we had plenty of footage, some 20 hours with Mr. Putin. And we asked, then the election happened. No one thought that Mr. Trump would win the election, and we came back again after the election and said if we could talk to him. And he gave us a 4th interview, and that is what is in all these 4 interviews were about 30 hours of film. We cut that down to 4 hours. Why? Because we asked. That's one thing. And I don't think he ever has had an audience at this length with the Western media.
No, he has not. But what was your aim when you did this?
I was very concerned since the Ukraine crisis. You see, I had not been paying close attention to U.S.-Russian relations. I was hopeful back in, I have to confess I was ignorant about what was going on. I had been to Moscow in the 90s, but I never saw beneath the surface. I had met Mr. Gorbachev a couple of times. I had interviews with him. I liked him very much. I also, you didn't mention it, but I also had worked on Untold History of the United States, which was a massive 12-hour effort on documentary on American television to understand American history since about 1900 and the imperialist adventures of America abroad, starting with the Philippine War. That was very popular in Russia too. In fact, you and I talked at length on Channel 1 interview. We had about an hour. It was a very grueling interview. You're a tough interviewer, and you were asking me some very hard questions. And I think I said it. I did as best as I could to explain it. I think it was a very popular series in Russia. So there is a history here. You also have to take into account that I had been here in the 1982. I had come as a screenwriter to do a movie about the dissident movement in Russia. So I actually traveled to 12 cities approximately, and I met with dissidents who had been in psychiatric hospitals. These were hardcore cases, people who had bucked the system. This was the old, I think Brezhnev was still in office at that time.
Yes.
It was cruel and hard, and the life was very tough, but I saw a bit of that. So I had a history here in Russia.
Did you actually make that movie about the dissidents?
No, we didn't make it because it was after Scarface, and Mr. Gorbachev came into power in 85, it was 86?
March of 85.
Okay, and after that, the story changed, so there was no need to tell the dissident story. Now maybe it has historical perspective. Certainly it was one of my better scripts. I wish I could have done it.
So you did this thing with Putin, and I still would like to know, what did you hope to achieve?
Well, the point is that I've had a view of Russia during the communist era, during the Gorbachev era, and during the Yeltsin era. And I didn't understand what happened between 2000 and 2014 with U.S.-Russia. Why did these relations go sour? And I thought this is a good subject for American audiences as well as European audiences. What went wrong? And in talking to Mr. Putin, I found out so much from the Russian point of view, which we never hear in the West. We heard all the American gripes about Russia. And certainly the Ukraine situation highlighted it. But even before Ukraine, the U.S. press, the media, particularly the establishment media, Washington Post, New York Times, was tearing apart Russia. And Putin was considered, it was thoroughly personalized in the sense that he was rendered as a thug and as a murderer. He killed his opponents. Horrible stories. You wouldn't want to see that in print about any world leader. Frankly, it was too much. I have always doubted the U.S. press, as you know, since Vietnam. I've had my own stories with them. And I've always tried to look beyond the headlines. So this seemed to be a ripe story. I came here with the hope of finding that out. And in those 4 interviews, sets of interviews, I really learned an enormous amount about what's going on in the world. Mr. Putin did not probably tell me everything. No, I didn't expect that. But he certainly told me a lot from his point of view. And it's the Russian point of view, which I tried to give to the American audience. I think it was much better received in Europe than it was in the United States. But in the United States, several million people did see it. And that's very important. Most people, when they criticize, don't see something.
True. I saw you on different American programs, television programs, where you were asked about that series.
Yeah.
And one of the criticisms that was consistently aimed at you was that you really didn't ask President Putin tough questions about Crimea, about Ukraine, about Syria, about the elections in Russia, about the fact that he had been in power so long, and wasn't that a corruption of some sort, that you seem to refrain from asking any of the tough questions.
Well, not really. In the fourth hour, I certainly asked him about his 3 terms in power. I asked him his plans for the fourth. I compared it to the Roosevelt period. I compared it to the Stalin period. I asked him about Stalin. I asked him several times about democracy, and he did put together his answer. It's in the film, the way he sees it. What I wasn't was rude. And I think there is a line. You don't go and do an interview like this with a world leader. There has to be an amount of respect. And I, as a filmmaker, expect respect from me. He gave me respect. I gave him respect. If I asked him Ukraine, and he told me his story of the Ukraine from top to bottom, from the economic EU through to the coup d'etat, through the annexation of Crimea, which he described in his own terms as a desire of the Crimean Parliament. Now, it's not for me to contradict that, because those were a series of events that happened that way. So what was going on behind the scenes was fascinating, and what he told me, to the degree that he told me, the phone calls with Obama. For example, he talked about the phone call the day before the change in government there, where the Americans promised that they would cool off the demonstrations. They would cool down, in return for which Yanukovych and his regime would not bring any weapons. Any bullets, would not be firing any rubber bullets would be used. So, in other words, there was all kinds of stories that I had never even dreamed of would be told. He was able to tell them. Same thing is true in Syria. He took us into the Syrian situation, which you have to understand, in the United States, we get the other story completely. You hear that Russia invaded Ukraine. So, and in Syria, you don't hear a very good story. You hear that Russia is backing a despotic government. Not according to, the way Mr. Putin lays it out, it was a very important move in Syria to solidify a country whose sovereignty was at stake. Now, that's the way he sees it. The way the United States sees it, I think you know, Syria is a country that is ripe for regime change. I don't know that you can win these arguments with the American press. You have to let Mr. Putin say it the way he sees it. Let him say it clearly, which I had to ask him a few times to repeat. And then I tried to cut it in a way where he was clear. So I think that there's a lot of answers to many questions in those interviews. NATO, especially, the American abrogation of the ABM treaty in 2001 by Mr. Bush, the American support of terrorism in the Caucasus, all these issues we hit on again and again. I think it's very clear.
How worried are you about the state of relations between Russia and the United States?
Oh, gosh, that is the worst question. And it scares me. I am concerned. And I think anybody who has common sense of our history should be concerned. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I lived through Ronald Reagan and the near war that we had in 1983. I was scared then. And I was a young man. I was 16 years old when the missile crisis happened. We thought it was over. We did not know what was going on behind closed doors. There was a very good movie made, actually, with Kevin Costner. It wasn't mine. It was 13 Days, which I think is a well-done account of how Kennedy handled this situation, which was very difficult for him because he had hardliners in his government, especially in the military, as Khrushchev had in this country. And we now know that the hardliners got rid of Khrushchev too. But it was really these two men, Khrushchev and Kennedy, that were the difference, I believe, between war, a war that could have ended in a nuclear disaster for this planet. Because we didn't even know about nuclear winter back then. And I don't think the Americans knew how many nuclear arms, the battlefield arms, nuclear arms the Russians had. Plus the commander I heard later in Cuba was one of the Stalingrad commanders. So you knew that they were going to fight. So where are we now? It's a strange time, and you know it as well as I do because you worked in the high levels of Washington. You saw the thinking. It's so scary because it's so ignorant. When Congress passed those sanctions with, I think, 2 dissensions in the Senate, very few in the House, it shows you that they don't know anything. The congressmen of the United States are very ignorant of the underlying stories here. They're willing to sanction Russia because it's a political thing to do. And when everybody starts running in a mob towards the edge of a cliff, you've got to be concerned. I don't see any countervailing narrative coming out in the American media. Those people are not allowed to speak. They're not. I see it in alternate media. I see it on the internet, but I don't see it in any case, in any way, shape, or form on our television, our public radio, and that's what's very disturbing.
Well, do you think there's any way that we, generally speaking, can change what's going on? I mean, do you have any hope for the future, except the general thing that, all right, we have hope, but is there anything that can be done to change the attitudes? As I said, I was just recently in New York, and even the more intellectual and, let's say, liberal-minded people have this completely negative view of Russia today, and of Putin in particular. Do you think that can be changed somehow?
There are people who write for scholarly journals and for the alternate media, internet. I see them. There's people like Stephen Cohn. I much admire him. There's people who write for Counterpunch, Consortium News, Bob Parry. Not enough. They don't get on television.
But it's a two-way street, you understand. It's a two-way street. You have the same thing here.
Is that true?
Of course. Very anti-American, very not so anti-Trump in a personal way, but, you know, America, this country that throws its weight around, that...
well, I wouldn't put them on an equal basis. I think America has much more power than Russia. The issue is nuclear because it doesn't matter how much power you have. And we know that America is modernizing its nuclear armaments and spending a lot of money doing it. So this is even more tricky because we don't know where the balance is right now. Mr. Putin may know. We know that America put a lot of missiles, anti-ballistic missiles, into Poland, I believe, and Romania. Am I right? I forgot exactly. There's 2. That's a big thing because it changes the nuclear balance. We know that America did it on the premise that those missiles were put there to prevent Iran from threatening Europe. We know that's a bullshit cover story. They did the same thing in Korea. They put the THAAD, T-H-A-A-D, missile into South Korea, which is a very dangerous missile system. China has been very upset with that and said so, but we keep saying that it's for North Korea. And we are arming Japan and we're arming Korea to the teeth right now. Now that, you know, there is a legitimate threat because North Korea has said so. But on the other hand, we do war exercises on the border of North Korea. They're starting another one in December. When we know that this aggravates the North Koreans to a maximum degree. I mean, we're playing with fire. And I think this is the American way now, and I don't understand why we are risking our economy, our way of life, over such goals as what? As trying to control the Ukraine, trying to regime change Russia, trying to regime change North Korea, and possibly trying to regime change China. I don't think that's a reasonable goal, but these goals are not in the realm of reality, in my opinion. And I think we have to accept the world as it is. So I fear that it's the American desire to control and change this world that makes it more dangerous. The Russian argument is not similar because you're not out to change regimes in North Korea, much less any interest in Europe, and I don't believe you have any interest really in Ukraine. That's a messed up regime and always was.
Since you talk about these things, I have to ask you this question, otherwise I would not be doing my job. Do you believe that the Russian government tried to interfere in the American elections, and if so, how successful were they? If you believe that story, I don't know.
Well, I asked Mr. Putin at length, and he was very firm in his denials. He always has been. I take that at face value, like Mr. Trump does. But also I asked him a lot of questions about cyber warfare in that fourth hour.
Yes.
And his answers were not as satisfying. Because cyber warfare is a very delicate issue, and it's changing day to day. I think there's a lot of things going on in that world that he's not at liberty to discuss. But the American cyber warfare program they spent a lot of money. They formed a new cyber command. We know that they've been active in China, in Russia, in North Korea, we know that, in Iran. That was where it started. They attacked Iran. We attacked Iran with Israel in 2000. We were successful in 2010 under Obama. We'd been trying for a few years. So we have developed cyber warfare. It's a weapon, a new form of weapon. American people don't act as if it exists, but it truly does. And the Russians know it, and I think they woke up maybe a little late. The Chinese certainly knew it, and they're very good at it, I gather. But we don't know where the next war will start. In other words, there will be an attack of some kind, chaos and confusion. Fingers will be pointed. So it's easy for the United States to say, Russia did it. That's what they're doing all the time, it seems. Russia is to blame. I want to answer that question because it's important. Ever since, there's been Julian Assange of WikiLeaks revealed Vault 7. It's very clear the United States CIA and NSA have the ability to imitate any country in the world, to leave its fingerprints of China or Russia or North Korea on anything. It leads me to, you can't believe what you read. In other words, if you hear that North Korea attacked Sony Pictures, I still don't quite believe it, because I know the United States has an agenda against North Korea. But I also know that there was leaks. People are disaffected at work. There might have been a leak at Sony Pictures instead of a hack. There might easily have been a leak at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention. Why? Because the DNC was rife with corruption. Bernie Sanders, who was the liberal socialist candidate for office and very close to winning the primaries, was viewed by many of the DNC as the enemy at that time. So there was a lot of malfeasance, corruption going on, and it's very easy to believe that a young staffer would leak those stories to Julian Assange at WikiLeaks. So there's always it's a reasonable scenario, but it was never entertained by the United States intelligence agencies. They went right to this scenario of the Russians. The Russians started influencing the election as early as summer of 2016 and earlier. But none of their evidence has worked. They haven't proven anything. In fact, the evidence that they presented that Facebook was involved has been ridiculous. The amount of advertising, much of it was after the election. It doesn't hold water. In other words, I haven't seen any one thing of any conviction. When you compare Russia to Israel, for example, or to Saudi Arabia spent a fortune influencing America as much as it can. And they have somehow achieved the cooperation of the United States. Mr. Trump went to Saudi Arabia first thing and told them, he wanted to be in business, basically.
Yes.
Israel has had a strong influence on American elections for many years. They're lobbying the United States. You know who I'm talking about, AIPAC. Very threatening to any congressman who votes against Israel. And as a result, the balance of power that existed between the United States and Israel, which was very strong, a strong alliance, but it was always balanced by considerations of the feelings of other people in the Middle East and in Russia and so forth. That has gone by the wayside. It seems like it's an open 100% support Israel. And Mr. Trump has also furthered that notion to me. So the United States has really lost its position as an educator, as a possibility of being a judge in these situations. It seems to be more of truly a protagonist.
You mentioned Julian Assange, who I had the opportunity to interview some time ago, and you also brought up Snowden. I saw the movie. I enjoyed it very much. But I have to ask you as an American, did you ever have the feeling that Edward Snowden betrayed his country? He was working in a very secret area. He was in the military. And he betrayed that secrecy. He made it public. Do you see him as a traitor? I ask you when I know that the answer is no, because I saw the movie. You see him as a hero? Who to you is Edward Snowden?
Well, the movie is the answer, but I see Ed. He lives here in Moscow, and I'm going to see him this trip.
You're going to see him?
Yeah. I very much admire what he did. As he says himself, he felt we had fundamentally crossed the line when we opened up our surveillance on everybody. And that's just not countries, it's people. And however, the technicalities, it bleeds back into the United States. Domestic eavesdropping is going on at a massive level, and always has been, frankly. It's been going on for years, since the 2001, but even before that, there was quite a bit of it. If you remember in the 1970s, when all the CIA revelations at that point, when they got Angleton, was because Angleton was listening in on with his chaos program, that he was cooperating with Hoover at the FBI against the anti-war opponents of the Vietnam War. So, I mean, the government has violated an agreement. The government was supposed to be working for the people of the United States, but is now the boss, very much the boss. People have no say. We have not adhered to the fundamentals of democracy. And Ed Snowden was an innocent, and he was a patriot of the highest order. He joined because of the 2001. He wanted to fight terrorism, but as he worked his way through these agencies, CIA and NSA, and he was also an advisor to the Defense Department, he found that in every which way we were not fighting terrorism. We were fighting for social and economic control.
У нас проблема с микрофоном, вы слышите треск. Это можно как-то исправить? Пожалуйста, обратите внимание, когда господин Стоун вот так делает головой, идет треск. Хорошо? Do you think he'll ever be able to go back home?
I wish he could, but with Mr. Trump in office, it doesn't seem likely. It's ironic because Mr. Trump at one point praised...
Его микрофон.
Am I breaking up?
You're getting crackling and stuff coming. I don't know what it is.
Should I take this off?
Тогда, может, вы снимете у него этот, как называется, намордник? Нет?
Take it off?
Yeah, take it off. It goes all the way down your back. Don't take it off afterwards. And then...
Okay, so, no, I wish he could go home. He's here. And he's criticized the Russian surveillance system, too. To be honest, I think I've heard that he's much more relaxed now about being here. At first he was worried about people hurting him coming from the United States, but I think he's adjusted. And I wish, Mr. Manning was pardoned after going 6 years in prison. Mrs. Manning, Miss Chelsea Manning.
Chelsea Manning.
And I'm glad she was, because she suffered greatly. But these are the people who are telling the truth. They should be heroes, and instead, people like Mr. Clapper, the head of the intelligence, Jim Clapper, John Brennan, Michael Hayden, these are the guys who should be in jail. They have really crossed the line, and they broke the Constitution, and they got away with it. That's what's the problem, because there's no consequences for those people who broke the law. And that goes to George Bush, Dick Cheney, people who went to war in Iraq on false pretenses and broke every international treaty in going into a sovereign country. So we've had a standard of behavior where we've broken the law and we've gotten away with it. And that encourages more and more of that kind of activity. So we got the wrong people in jail, and unfortunately, the good people are living in Russia. At least Mr. Snowden is.
All right, let's back up.
And Julian, don't forget to say, is in an embassy in the Ecuadorian embassy in London.
4 years thus far. Let's back up a little bit here. Could you tell us, how did you get into movies? How did that happen? What brought you into the film business?
I was never like this back then. I learned a lot as I went. I got into the business right after the Vietnam War. I came back and I went into, after a few months, I went to a film school on the GI Bill at NYU, New York University. I studied film there because that was a new thing of study. It didn't exist before that. It was a new field of study, and young people were doing it. Not many. I was very lucky in my timing because, it was just unbelievable to me that you could actually go and study films, go to films in your class time and write about, or even get a chance to make them. And we started with small 16mm films of about a minute, less than a minute. It was a craft. It was a craft that you learned. I studied with Martin Scorsese. He was a young teacher then. I learned from him. His energy was great. I went into the film world after 3 years, but I got nowhere. I did many jobs. I wrote 8-9 scripts, kept submitting them, kept getting rejections, wrote treatments. I was working in a sports film company for a while. I drove a taxi for a while. I was temporary jobs. I was a messenger. I did all kinds of work. I was married to a woman who helped support me. And I eventually got a break after about 7 years.
7 years?
Yeah, approximately. And Robert Bolt, the English screenwriter, Man for All Seasons, Dr. Zhivago, Lawrence of Arabia, he wrote those screenplays. He liked the script I wrote, took me under his wing, and helped me rewrite it. We didn't make that movie. It was called The Cover-Up. It was about the Patty Hearst kidnapping. But I remember the experience of working with Robert. It really changed me and made me even more sober about this business. And eventually, I had a breakthrough with Midnight Express in 1977-8. Midnight Express.
Great movie.
Well, thank you.
Great movie.
Yeah.
And that's when you...
Thank you. The movie was a low-budget movie, did very well, and one thing after another, and eventually I got to direct. I got to direct The Hand, which is a horror film. I still like it, but it wasn't successful. Then I went back to writing Scarface, Conan the Barbarian, The Year of the Dragon. And I turned around and I did Salvador first as a writer-director.
That's another great one.
Thank you.
Salvador.
With Jimmy Woods. And then Platoon in 1986.
Platoon must have been based on your experience in Vietnam.
It was partly based, certainly the spirit of it. I'm not going to, 50% of it, I'd say, was pretty close to what happened. But what I saw in Vietnam was, again, maybe I'm seeing things, but I felt like we were fighting ourselves. I think the enemy was there, no doubt, it was realistic, but I thought that we had sent over such a big elephant to fight small, a flea basically. And we're overdoing it. Everything was overdone in the American sense. So as a result, there were so many casualties in that war. So many of them came from friendly fire, killing ourselves. Somewhat like the Soviets had an experience in Afghanistan. It was a national humiliation. But when I came back to America, there was a period when people would not even talk about it. But when Mr. Reagan came into office in 1980, which is only about 7 years after the war ended for America, Reagan managed to restage the Vietnam War historically as an honorable war, if you remember correctly. You were there. And he said, we should not be ashamed of that war, we should be proud of it. And that mantra has now gone into the national fabric, and you hear every president says the same thing. America is an exceptional place, fights exceptional wars.
Just wars.
Just wars, yes, like Augustine said. I think, well, you were there during the Reagan era, so you know that was a very important change in the guard there.
And while you're pouring yourself some water, I'd like to ask you about JFK. I remember when I saw that movie, I was really very impressed by it. And at some point I thought, is Oliver Stone trying to make me believe that this was a conspiracy of parts of the American government or the business elite against President Kennedy, and is in fact even using documentary footage spliced into the body of the film to kind of get to me in ways that I can't stand up to.
I can only take you through the steps. It was, as you know, I had made visceral films. I mean, Midnight Express, very tactile. They hit you in the gut. And Platoon certainly was there. And then I did Born on the 4th of July, which is about a young man who's paralyzed in Vietnam. You felt Tom Cruise, and you felt his paralysis. So I always had that. I was a feeling filmmaker. I believed in get behind the feeling. When I read the Jim Garrison book, On the Trail of the Assassins, and I met him, and then I also read other books, of course, I felt intuitively that Jim Garrison had lived this story. And a man who wrote this book, if you read the book, and you would recognize that he lived this story. It's not made up, it's not glamorized. He gives you his case, and it's the same book he wrote 20 years earlier. So he wrote 2 books that were the same story. A man doesn't do that unless he has a very strong conviction. I say this because Garrison was one of the most criticized of figures for having reopened the case, but he is the only public official who ever opened the case. The story was buried right away by the FBI saying that Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin. All that information comes out in the first few hours of the assassination. They knew everything. Oswald was the guilty party 2 hours after, because it was a cover story that had been set up. So once you get into this area of covert warfare, covert action, it's very difficult to make an American audience understand what covert activity is, because everybody believes that you act in an overt fashion. The concept of a CIA or an intelligence agency operating independently of oversight and just doing what it had to do, wanted to do, is very hard for people to understand. And I think Garrison had that problem in his case. But all the evidence on that day, all the evidence is wrong. The evidence has been besmirched, compromised, stained. The best single book about it that I have is not only Jim DiEugenio's Reclaiming Parkland, which is going to be republished again. Republished. It's very important to go back and examine the information that day. Also, James Douglas wrote a book called JFK and the Unspeakable, which is also crucial to the understanding of why and how. But Kennedy was a man who was moving in a new direction to end the Cold War with Khrushchev.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that? What do you mean moving in a new direction?
Well, it's a pretty large story.
But it's an important story.
Yeah, it is a gigantic story. He was moving in this. In Vietnam, he had issued a secret order that was going to be revealed after the election to remove the troops from Vietnam. He knew that Vietnam was a losing proposition. It was called, I don't want to go into all the details, National Security Action Memorandum 263. The 3 days after he died, Lyndon Johnson changed it to 273 and different language. That language heightened and heightened and heightened. Within 3 months of his election, Johnson was sending combat troops to Vietnam. He sent ultimately 525,000 combat troops. Kennedy did not have one combat troop there. He had advisors. In addition to that, Kennedy was moving towards negotiation with Castro, backdoor negotiations. All this is very difficult to do when you have a cabinet and an administration and a time period when America is essentially pretty hawkish. There is a feeling in the military that they were denied the ability to go into Vietnam, that they wanted to go into Laos in 1961. You know what, Laos is a small country. Kennedy turned them down. Kennedy did not go into the Bay of Pigs. Now, again, it was a CIA operation to end Castro's rule in Cuba. They thought that Kennedy would support that when the Cuban freedom fighters were challenged and stalled on the beaches of Cuba. He did not do that. So he took actions that were against the interests of the American. Here we go again. A deep state, if you want. Also, with Russia, he made an agreement with Khrushchev in 1963 for nuclear overground testing, atmospheric testing. The peace treaty on nuclear weapons.
Also his famous speech at American University.
Well, that was a speech, yeah. The speech comes on the heels of that. But that peace treaty was an amazing first step. It was like Gorbachev and Reagan. Tremendous importance. In so many ways, Kennedy was moving to end the Cold War, to get America off this path of spending more and more money that Eisenhower had warned about.
The military-industrial complex.
Yes. Which haunts us all. And by the way, you said earlier, Russia, you have your hardliners here. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean here in this country? Where the pressure is coming from? Because I've heard Russian candidates for president are more nationalistic than Mr. Putin.
A lot of, I think, basically, I'm happy to answer your questions. I believe I was brought in.
It's a quickie, I'm sorry.
But I'll very briefly tell you that because of the way Russia has been treated by the West, and specifically the United States, since the falling apart of the Soviet Union, because of a lack of respect, being told to just shut up, you guys lost the Cold War, we're not going to talk to you anymore, you're of no importance. The Russians, who are a proud people, have gradually moved in a more nationalistic direction as a result of that, and a more kind of anti-Western sentiment as a result of that. Oh, so that's the way you're going to treat us? Well, that's the kind of thing that you run into nowadays. And I certainly don't support it, but I know where it's coming from.
Well, the danger again is always not only the policy, but the real danger is the accidents that happen.
Yes.
The near misses.
The near misses, yes, indeed. Well, talking about movies. I mean, there are all kinds of rumors about the way you work. That you're very tough with your actors. How do you feel about it? I mean, you've worked with some great actors, right? Are they prima donnas? How do you act with them? Tom Cruise, who's a big name. Do you tell him, Mr. Cruise, do this or do? How do you work with those people?
No. I think the secret to working with actors is individuals. Everybody is different. The actors are not a group. They all came up their own way. They all have their own ideas. I try to work with them one-on-one. I try to put together a rehearsal at the beginning so that we all kind of a general sense of the script, where we're going. But that doesn't often work because sometimes actors are in different places, different films, and it happens very quickly. But you try to get a big rehearsal. If not, rehearse as much as you can. As much as you can. Nothing wrong with rehearsing. That's not to say you're doing it, but you're practicing. You're hearing it. You're hearing it. And with an actor, I feel like it's like playing, you're a bit of a coach. In other words, you could say I'm tough because I want the actor to do his best. I want the actor to find the strongest, most valid way to do his role. I want him to try. I want him to feel that this is important. There's nothing worse for me than an actor who approaches us like, I've done this before, I've done this 50 times, and don't worry, I can do it. I understand that attitude, and I understand where it comes from, but it doesn't make me feel secure. Some people you do want to get them, you don't need much, you need a conventional performance, but there are key roles in every movie. Let's say 7 or 8, 10 roles in every movie that really require attention and work. So cast carefully. If you cast wrong, that's tough. You sometimes have to let somebody go or find another way to do this. But there's always problems of communication with everybody. I try really to run it as democratically as possible, but as you know, a movie set has to go. There is a time period. So that's what rehearsal is for. Do it before you get to the set as much as you can, because a movie moves like a machine, like a train, and the parts have to go together, and we have to get to the destination on time. Otherwise, you get cut off.
I was, as I was preparing to meet you today, I went through your filmography, and I counted 20 full-length feature films that you've done.
That's right.
That's pretty amazing. 20 films, and I don't know how many awards and all of that. Of all of those films, are there any, well, they're probably all to a certain extent, but are there some that really stand out for you personally, that you look back on with a sense of, I don't know, fondness, pride, whatever?
I used to answer that the same way, but I guess I'm getting older now. Because every one of those 20 films was very hard to make.
Sure.
Every day you go to work and you have to do your best, and you fault yourself if you don't feel you lived up to it. For example, Alexander in 2004, I had a tough post-production schedule, and I had to finish it faster than I'd wanted. And I had a studio partner that was difficult for me, and they wanted to show the film too early. This happens to other directors, it's not, but it happens a lot. So the film that came out in 2004 did not make me feel that I'd done my best. I went back 3 times, actually twice, and did a DVD version, 2007, and a 2014 version called The Ultimate Alexander, which to me has finally gotten me to where I wanted to get to with this very difficult project. 2014, 10 years later. Platoon took 10 years to make. It was written in 76, it was done in 86. Born on the 4th of July was written in 79, and it was made in 1989. There's a strange symmetry to that. It was 10 years later for each one. And I never thought when I wrote them that I was going to direct them, because I was looking for another director to get it done. So I ended up being the director. That's the way sometimes fate works. Which ones? Yeah, sure, the Vietnam ones, they add up because it was my personal experience. Certainly JFK was the most tortured for me as a post-production because I had never been so criticized, nor did I jump out into the public eye like that. I had been relatively quiet. After JFK, it was hard to hide, you know. The media had called me out and called me all kinds of things. And then Natural Born Killers was also very painful and difficult because of the criticism of its violence and misunderstandings of what I was trying to do. And then I still look back on The Doors, which I loved as something that I wanted to do very badly because I loved the music and Jim Morrison. So making that film was a delight, but also very painful and difficult too. More recently, I won't say, you know, Wall Street, you can say this, that. You know, I loved making World Trade Center. It was very difficult. Painful too, because we had smoke in our lungs every day. And then working on W with this George Bush story, very contemporary. It was very, very controversial. But remember, the movie ends in 2004 when Mr. Bush goes to Iraq. He goes into Iraq. I made it in 2008 when his presidency was ending. So it had nothing to do with those last 4 years. I felt like his life, we knew what his life was going to be when he committed to the war in Iraq. So I finished a story that starts as a young man. So everything has its place, everything has its reason, its heart. Snowden was very difficult because of the computer work and a world I don't know. Ed Snowden introduced me to something that I had, how to put that on film was difficult. Computer life. And the documentaries, 7 or 8 of them now, from Castro to Chavez to Mr. Putin to Arafat, and Netanyahu was in one, have given me a breadth of knowledge and wisdom that I'm so glad I did documentaries. I would like to make some more. Because you go back to the front, like you're a journalist, you know, you go back to the front lines. If you live in Hollywood only, you get artificial.
Obviously, film has been the center of your life. And what I'd like to ask is there anything is there a film that you wish you hadn't done, looking back on it? I mean, as a journalist, I know there are things that I wrote that I wish I hadn't.
Such as?
Well, I told you I was a propagandist. And propaganda is often a half lie or a half truth. Very often. And I often regret the fact that I was involved in that. I wish it gave me some knowledge and what have you, but I'm not proud of it, let's put it that way. So is there anything at all, is there a movie that you say to yourself, gosh, I wish I hadn't made that movie? Or not? Not necessarily, I'm just kind of interested.
It's when you ask the question, my first thought was the movies I hadn't been able to make that I worked so hard to make.
That's a different story.
It's a different story, but there is no one movie that I regret.
That's good.
There are things in the movie that I regret, and I think I could have done better. But the 2 movies were My Lai. I worked on I was down to we had 3 weeks left in rehearsal. 3 weeks. We had built the whole village in Thailand. My Lai was a massacre in Vietnam, and I really wanted to make this movie, and it died because the stock brokerage firm Merrill Lynch went under in 2007-8. If you remember, that was the beginning of the financial crisis. So our main backer, our financial backer, was out of business. The world was changing.
Yes.
And the other one was Evita, which I had written. And I was going to make it with Meryl Streep back in the 90s, but we had a scheduling conflict. She was doing and I was doing. I wish I could have made Evita. I had a second chance with Michelle Pfeiffer a few years later, but again, she had a problem with scheduling, so it didn't happen. And then I lost control of the project. But I think I could have made a lot better Evita. And I always wanted to do a musical.
We have a minute left. Is there one movie that you have not made and you still hope to make?
Yeah, there's one, but I can't tell you about it. A producer is sitting out there, and hopefully he will be successful. in raising the financing for it. It's a personal story, a movie. I've never done this kind of movie before. It's a real risk for me, and I hope I'm not too old to pull it off.
Well, first of all, I think we all hope that you can make it, so wish you that. Thank you very much for this conversation. I found it fascinating, really did. And the best of luck to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Спасибо, друзья. Спасибо вам.